Hello everyone. What you're watching right now is a commentary video for the game Super Mario Land. I'm going to be playing through the entirety of this game while giving my thoughts on it, among other things like insight on its development and its role in the greater Mario pantheon. While we're here, why don't we get some of the basics out of the way. Super Mario Land was a launch title for the Game Boy, Nintendo's first handheld, and released on April 21st, 1989. Attempting to capitalize on Mario's popularity, Super Mario Land was intended to be the pack-in title for the system in the West, but was switched with Tetris shortly before launch. Considering the fact that Tetris is attributed to the Game Boy being the third best-selling video game system of all time, it's hard to fault this change, but it is still interesting to imagine a timeline where Mario was the pack-in title. When playing this game, the first thing you'll probably notice is Mario's control. It's a far cry from the likes of Super Mario Bros. 3, the most recent console game compared to this game's release. You have complete control over Mario in the air, unlike some previous Mario games. In those, if you were running in a direction, redirecting your jump in the opposite direction gave you very little horizontal distance. This might sound like a good change, and in most cases I would agree, but there's more to it than that. Coupled with complete control over Mario in the air is a Mario with absolutely zero momentum in his movement. As soon as you let go of the D-pad, Mario will come to a complete stop. This makes platforming feel quite stiff, which can make seemingly simple platforming tasks quite difficult if you aren't careful. Every Mario game has had a slightly different control from its predecessor, so change was to be expected here. But it's hard to deny that they could have done a better job. I believe it's easy to tell what should have been tweaked here, as the next Mario platformer to be released in Japan was Super Mario World, a game which featured Mario with full control over his jumps, but also carried momentum while on the ground. I don't think I'm alone when I consider Super Mario World to be the best Nintendo had ever gotten Mario to control in a 2D space, so I think they were at least onto something with this handheld installment. But with all that said, it's unfair to be comparing these two games. Of course, Super Mario Land isn't going to hold a candle to Super Mario World when it comes to control. But even against Super Mario Bros. 1, the game Super Mario Land is most similar to, the favorite is clear. In short, Mario's control isn't the best in this game, and needed more adjusting to feel right. The sequel, Super Mario Land 2, is a more conventional Mario game when it comes to control, among other things, and it feels all the better because of that. In case you weren't aware, I'm playing this on a Super Game Boy 2, which is a piece of hardware that lets you play Game Boy games on a Super Nintendo. I don't want to rattle off all the features it has if I don't have to, but in addition to letting you play Game Boy games on your TV, it also gives your games limited color palettes. Other games like Donkey Kong 94 come with even more features, but Super Mario Land isn't one of those games built with this device in mind. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is this isn't how Super Mario Land looked when it first launched. Game Boy screens were monochrome, which meant that they were only able to display images in varying shades of black and white. Although anyone who has used the Game Boy knows those colors more as a green and a dark green thanks to the dot matrix screen. Because the Game Boy could only display 4 different shades of black and white, certain concessions had to be made to accommodate for this. One of those concessions is changing the green 1-up mushroom to a more conventional 1-up heart. Despite how odd it is to see Mario collect hearts for extra lives, I think this was a smart change. A lesser developer would probably have tried to make the power-up mushrooms all black and 1-ups all white with a black outline or something. But dropping all pretenses and just changing the 1-up design outright makes it so there's absolutely no confusion between the two. We've just passed by a few of the deaths that I accumulated during this playthrough. Most of them can be attributed to me being reckless, which is why you've probably noticed by now that I don't really use the run button much in this playthrough. The reasoning for this partly doubles back to the spiel I said earlier about Mario's control. Running has a clear purpose in the 2D Mario games. In exchange for shorter reaction times to incoming hazards and a slightly more uncontrollable Mario, you were able to finish stages faster and jump further distances. It also just felt satisfying to see Mario quickly gain speed as you held down the button. In Super Mario Land, Mario accelerates from 0 to 100 instantly, but besides that, it functions mostly the same as it does in the other games, which is actually where the problem lies. The reason for this is actually fairly obvious, but I've got 25 minutes to kill, so I'll explain it. While the trade-off with running was more than fair in other Mario games, in this portable entry it's much less appealing. Mario is already somewhat unruly to control, so running to make him even more uncontrollable is not a good idea for most players. But the real reason running isn't a good idea is because of the reaction time. The Game Boy screen is a paltry 160 by 144 pixels. The risk of getting hit by a rogue enemy is significantly more likely because of the limited screen real estate. There's even an enemy that capitalizes on this, which we will be seeing later in this playthrough. In their defense, I think R&D1, the internal developer of not only this game, but the hardware itself, knew that this was a problem, so they tried to work around it. And it seems they did so by shrinking almost everything to some degree. The Goombas and Koopas of Super Mario Land are probably about a fourth of their original size. Most everything else wasn't shrunk down as drastically. Perhaps they figured they could get away with making those enemies tiny in particular because the player would already be familiar with them. Personally, I'm of two minds about the shrinkage. While it does mean enemies are easier to avoid, it also means they're just plain harder to hit. I usually just don't even bother trying to stomp on small enemies due to fearing I'll miss and get hit. That isn't the screen or the run button's fault though. Well, I guess it is partly the run button's fault, since it's the controls that make me hesitant to stomp the smaller creatures. What I'm showing off right now is a new power-up introduced in this game, and until Super Mario Maker 2 it was the only time it had appeared. This item is called the Super Ball, and it's very similar to the Fire Flower from other Mario games. It even looks like it. But the Super Ball works slightly differently. Instead of merely bouncing across the ground, the Super Ball will fly around in a 45-degree angle, hurting or defeating enemies it comes in contact with, and even collecting coins. The latter's utility is quite a welcome addition, although admittedly niche in the open spaces most of the levels occupy. And then there's what I said about hurting and defeating enemies. Super Mario Land actually has certain enemies that require more than one Super Ball to be pacified. At first, I wasn't sure if it was just wonky hitboxes, but after it continued to happen, I figured it out. I'm honestly not sure why they felt the need for this, to be honest. It's not like the Super Ball is horrendously overpowered or anything, just a unique take on the iconic Fire Flower. I've ignored the elephant in the room for a while, but now I think it's time to discuss the plot and setting of Super Mario Land. Surprisingly, for a Mario game, I have a lot to talk about regarding this. The basic plot to Super Mario Land is very familiar. Mario has to rescue a princess from a bad guy. However, that isn't to say things aren't different. Instead of Princess Toadstool/Peach, Mario is rescuing Princess Daisy. Instead of defeating King Koopa/Bowser, Mario must defeat Tatanga. The setting is also different. Princess Daisy rules over Sarasaland, a place that is unmistakably not the Mushroom Kingdom. Due to these differences, Super Mario Land ends up being one of the most bizarre mainline Mario games in the series, and it only gets more strange the further the series is removed by it. All the enemies in this game feel off or out of place. Even the familiar ones like Goombas and Koopas have different designs. To go even further though, the Koopa equivalent preys on your knowledge of how Koopas worked in previous games. If you've been paying attention, you would have noticed that you can't kick away the shells from Koopas once you jump on them. Instead, they'll explode after a moment like bombs. This is a bit of a dirty trick, but I don't think it's all that bad. It's something that'll catch you off guard once, if ever. One could even argue that since their shells look somewhat like bombs, it's contextual enough to get a pass. I don't know if I'd go that far though. With things as abstract as they are on the Game Boy screen, I don't think people's first reaction to seeing the Koopa's shell would be that it's a bomb. And yes, I know it's technically not a Koopa, I'll get to that. Anyway, back on track, the setting of Sarasaland has a lot of elements that would be considered unusual for a Mario game, such as, say, inexplicably entering the current level in a UFO. In the greater Mario universe, this is nonsensical, but in the context of Super Mario Land, it makes a little sense. The villain of this game, Tatanga, is an alien after all. The game will only get weirder the further we go, so keep your eyes open for things that could be considered unusual, such as the iconic Power Star theme being replaced with the Can-Can. As to why this game is so weird, I believe I have an answer to this, but it might not be as simple as I lay out right now. Mario Land was the first game in the Mario series to not be developed by a team led by Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka. Instead, development was helmed by R&D1, which was ran by Gunpei Yokoi, who was one of the most respected members of the company at the time, possibly even more than Miyamoto. Satoru Okada, the director of Kid Icarus, was made director, while R&D 1 made games like Metroid, Kid Icarus, and even the original Mario Bros. They were mostly a hardware division, and they hadn't touched the Mario series since Miyamoto and Tezuka created Super Mario Bros. This game could be seen as R&D 1 putting their own spin onto Mario after being away from the character for so long, possibly making it intentionally strange, all the while still trying to make it feel like a Mario game. Did they succeed? I'll leave that question for the end. Keep this idea in mind until then. I will say this though, despite the music for this game not being done by series veteran Koji Kondo, it manages to rival the original Super Mario Bros. In catchy tunes. Hirokazu Tanaka makes his series debut with this title, and I pretty much love every track in this game. It's surprising to me then that they've mostly been forgotten. The Underground theme had a remix in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, but for the most part these tunes stayed in this game. Speaking of weird, we've reached the first of the two shooter levels in this game. This one takes place underwater, while the other takes Mario to the sky. This could be seen as another curveball decision by R&D 1 to make this game stand out from its predecessors, but putting Mario in a shoot-'em-up level was actually an idea Miyamoto had for the first Super Mario Bros. These horizontal shooters are far from the robust experiences of the likes of Gradius or R-Type, but they work as breezy levels to shake up the formula a tad. In that way, they're almost like Super Mario Land's answer to the underwater levels of Super Mario Bros. The boss of this world is a seahorse named Dragon Zamasu. If you think that name is a tad weird, then allow me to explain something about the enemy names in Super Mario Land. They were all left untranslated when Nintendo of America localized the game, which is the reason why instead of Goombas and Koopas, we have Chibibos and Nokobons. Now, the name Dragon Zamasu can actually be deciphered once we know that fact. Zamasu in Japanese is a verb meaning to exist. Dragon is of course just dragon, so Dragon Zamasu's name roughly means I am a dragon. You might object and exclaim that it is actually a seahorse, but that's part of the joke. Take a look at the Japanese word for seahorse. Romanized here, it reads Tatsu no Otoshigo, which literally means dragon's bastard child. Bastard in this case meaning illegitimate. The way I interpret this is Dragon Zamasu's name was meant as a gag, poking fun at the origins of the word seahorse in the developer's native language. We've reached the halfway point for Super Mario Land. There's only 4 worlds in this game, and each world has 3 levels, leaving us with 12 to go through. That's less than half of the amount of levels seen in the original Super Mario Bros., but what's important to keep in mind is this is a portable game without a battery backup or password system. The fact that this game could be beaten within a car ride was likely seen as a feature, if nothing else. However, while there isn't a password system, there's something similar to it. If you beat Super Mario Land, you can unlock a hard mode of the game, and when that's beaten, you're given access to a level select. To be honest, this comes off as a bit of a pointless gesture. After all, you just finished beating the game twice in one sitting. Are you really interested in replaying any of the levels again? This isn't something you can just save for later either, because once you turn the game off, you lose access to the level select. That said, I'd like to imagine that this was all they could think of to reward players who spent so much time playing their game, short of giving them access to a debug mode. The third world of Super Mario Land is known as the Easton Kingdom. Sarasaland's 4 worlds are almost all based off of real-world locations. Birabuto World 1 is based off of Egypt. This was most noticeable in the underground location of the 3rd level. Muda World 2 is partly based off of Bermuda, as well as the mythological city of Mu. Mu has a similar story to that of Atlantis, a city which sunk to the bottom of the ocean under mysterious circumstances. This would explain why the 3rd level of that world takes place underwater. I'm not sure if the UFOs are meant to serve as some sort of explanation for how it sunk into the ocean, or rather that the UFOs originate from that world. It's a Mario game from 1989, so it's probably neither, and I'm just being another annoying, overanalyzing dumbass talking about video games online. Anyway, Easton is based off of Easter Island, which should be obvious due to all the Moai statues. It's also where we're introduced to Tototoko, the little moe statues with arms and legs that run like they got somewhere to go. This is the enemy I was alluding to earlier in the commentary, the one that capitalizes on your reduced reaction time. I'm somewhat torn on the implementation of this enemy. I think it's a good idea to introduce enemies that are more difficult the further you progress into the game, and I think we see that implemented well with a different enemy that appears in the final world. The problem is that Tototoko's difficulty comes from highlighting some of Super Mario Land's biggest flaws. The cramped screen real estate first and foremost, but in addition are some problems that aren't as apparent in this commentary. Remember, I'm playing on a Super Game Boy, which means that I don't have to suffer through the non-backlit puke Game Boy screen. A screen that also suffers from ghosting artifacts, I might add. I'm sure the Tototokos blindsided loads of unsuspecting kids back in the day, so overall, I'd say it isn't a very great enemy, probably my least favorite in the game. Interestingly, the Easton Kingdom is the only world in the game that doesn't have any tracks that play exclusively in it. Instead, it borrows its tracks from Birabuto Kingdom. My gut reaction is to once again say this was a hardware limitation, but after doing some research, I'm not so sure. In an age where file sizes for games can be up to 100 gigabytes, one should keep in mind just how small games needed to be back then. The Game Boy could technically support games up to 4 megabytes. And if you don't know what a megabyte is, I don't blame you, since it hasn't really been adopted by the wider doctrine. It's equal to about 4.3 megabytes. From a layman, it feels like the imperial and metric system of data storage, but I digress. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to megabytes and kilobytes from now on. While the Game Boy could support games up to that size, it didn't mean games could afford to be that big. Literally. It would be far too expensive to print millions of game carts with 4 megabyte ROM chips inside each and every one of them, so the philosophy was to make games as small as possible. Super Mario Land used a cart that supported up to 64 kilobytes, but the game's file size is actually 37. To put that into perspective, the thumbnail for this video is 7 times larger than this entire game. Amazingly, this also makes Super Mario Land a larger game than the original Super Mario Bros. By 6 kilobytes. So there's about 27 kilobytes unaccounted for that they could have used for additional tracks, or anything for that matter in theory. Why they didn't, I'm not sure. Baseball, another Game Boy launch title, is 37 kilobytes, so there might be some significance to that file size I'm unaware of. Sadly, there isn't much in the way of developer interviews or documentation on Super Mario Land that could shed light on these questions. People have dug into the game's files, and there actually is an unused music track. However, it's merely an extended version of the bonus game theme, where the arrangement goes further up the scale. To make this clear, I'm not completely lamenting that this world doesn't have any unique tracks. Birabuto's music is excellent, but the reused music definitely sticks out. One last thing I will mention about the music in this world is the underground theme is used twice. Using it in the second level makes sense, as it does appear to take place underground, but the final level of Easton is like some sort of mix. It starts on what appears to be the surface, but transitions into a cave. Well, it appears to do that, at least. With games as primitive looking as Mario Land, you have to get your mind to fill in the blanks on these sort of things. I want to talk about the boss of this level, but before I do that, I'm going to backtrack a little and talk about King Totomesu, the first boss of this game, since I was busy talking about the run button or something when I beat him. Totomesu's name, when translated from katakana to English, comes out as Thutmose, which was the name of several Egyptian pharaohs. There's also a small inconsistency between his sprite and official artwork. The sprite depicts Totomesu with a goatee, while his art in the instruction manual does not. Not a big deal, but interesting nonetheless. Out of all the fights in this game, Totomesu is most similar to Bowser's fights in Super Mario Bros., and him being the first boss you fight doesn't feel like a coincidence. I think it helps to make the later fights that much more unexpected by having them contrast towards the original Bowser fight. I'm bringing this up now because out of all the fights in this game, Hioihoi, the boss of Easton, is most similar to Totomesu and, by extension, Bowser. Hioi is a Japanese onomatopoeia meaning to throw something away, and since throwing rocks is Hioihoi's one and only attack, it's not hard to see the connection here. Amusingly, in the instruction manual, it says that Hioihoi evolved from a Tototoko. The resemblance is certainly there, I just think it's funny that instead of saying he's their boss or something, they say it was evolution, meaning that Darwinism is canon to Super Mario Bros. Amazing. A lot of enemies made their series debut with Super Mario Land, but they also only ever appeared in this entry. More enemies from the American Super Mario Bros. 2, a game that wasn't even originally a Mario game, became recognized as series staples than the Rogues Gallery of this game. Despite this, I happened to notice some similarities between the Moai enemies of Easton Kingdom and a creature that appears in Super Mario Odyssey. The Moais of the Sand Kingdom bear such a striking resemblance to the Tototokos and Hioihoi, I wondered at first if they were one and the same. I couldn't find any confirmation on this, but I would find it hard to believe that they weren't at least inspired by the Moai creatures of Super Mario Land. In this playthrough, I don't exactly use the intended method of defeating Hioihoi. Instead, I use the tried and true method of running past the boss by tanking the hit with my power-up. It's somewhat anticlimactic, but it's not the most anticlimactic way to defeat a boss in Super Mario Land. Dragon Zamasu can be skipped entirely by just shooting the blocks that guard the exit to the level. That one borders on downright humiliating. Whenever you defeat a boss in a world, you're given a chance to play the bonus game. You can play this after every level if you're skilled enough to make it to the higher goal, but even if you're not good enough to make it to those, you're given the opportunity to play it at least 3 times in a playthrough. It's not exactly a very deep game, but it's likely to be your main resource for lives. Unless you already have the Super Ball power-up, you'll always come out on top when playing this game. And chances are, if you're entering the bonus game with the Super Ball, you're also not in a position where you're scraping for lives. This was the first time a Super Mario game had a bonus game for lives after levels, at least in Japan. Americans had the slot machine game after levels in their version of Super Mario Bros. 2. I quite like the inclusion of these games, but as someone who is half decent at Super Mario Land, they make it quite easy to stock up on lives and never worry about a game over. Not exactly a bad thing, Mario games were never meant to be the pinnacle of difficulty, but it's something to take note of. At the beginning of Easton, I mentioned that each world is based off of a real-life location. Can you guess what the Chai Kingdom is based off of? I'll give you a few seconds to guess. This is probably my favorite world in the entire game. It feels so realized and unique compared to the previous 3. It's the last world, so I can see why they want to go all out for this one. Out of all the worlds, I think the Chai Kingdom is the one that most wears its real-world influences on its sleeve. Partly because it's not only the visuals that help with legwork, which I'll get to soon, but the music as well. You can make the case that the underground theme from Birabuto helps to convey the Egyptian theme of that world, and while I would agree, it's only heard in the last level of that world and is featured in the Easton Kingdom more, where the Snake Charmer melody makes less sense. As soon as you enter the Chai Kingdom, the first thing you hear is the iconic East Asian riff. The rest of the song screams ancient China as well. My favorite aspect of the track is the incredibly low beeps throughout, meant to simulate a thumping bass guitar. It bears repeating, Hirokazu Tanaka knocked it out of the park with the soundtrack. Tanaka was responsible for a lot of the soundtracks to R&D 1 titles, but he's most well known for being one of the composers for Mother 1 and 2, or Earthbound Beginnings and Earthbound if you live in the West. Sadly, he never returned to compose another non-spin-off Mario game. I would have loved to hear what else he could have brought to the series. Tanaka hasn't been attached to any projects as composer for about 20 years or so. He's the CEO of Creatures Inc., one of the shareholders of the Pokemon IP, so I'd say he's doing pretty well for himself. Apparently, he also DJs in Japanese nightclubs occasionally. Neat. While the music in this level is excellent, I don't want to discredit the visuals either. I've called the visuals to Super Mario Land rudimentary or primitive earlier in this commentary, but I think a better phrase to use would be less is more. The graphics are simple for sure, but I don't think it's a particularly ugly game either. You'll hear a lot of game designers from back in the day appreciate limitations just as much as they lament them, because it's almost like a challenge to convey places like Egypt or China on the Game Boy of all things. The previous worlds felt a little more subdued in the visual department, but the Chai Kingdom is a lot more vibrant in this regard. The bamboo stalks, and later the cloudy mountaintops in the background stick out more than any other background element, even the large moai heads of Easton. And I think there are a few reasons for that. For one, there's just a ton of them, they litter the stage. Another thing helping is the color scheme chosen by the Super Game Boy, but a less noticeable aspect might be the lack of negative space in this level. Up at the top of the scoreboard are these swirls that stay for a majority of the first two levels of Chai. Unlike the sunset aesthetic of Birabuto, this doesn't really occur naturally in the real world, so it sticks out like a sore thumb. Finally, the level design itself doesn't have nearly as much negative space as the previous worlds. Immediately, you're treated to huge walls of unbreakable blocks. This not only leaves less room for the blank white background, but makes the background elements more noticeable. Additionally, it makes the game harder. The Chai Kingdom, being the last world, should be the hardest. Enemies are seen in their highest numbers. Pakun flowers are in just about every pipe, and if they aren't, then Giras are flying out. There's plenty of Nokobans as well, but the star enemy of this world has to be the Pionpi. They're similar to the Dry Bones enemies. Jumping on them will defeat them for a time, but before you know it, they'll come back to life. Pionpi bears a striking resemblance to the Jiangshi, a mythological Chinese vampire. They're undead creatures that were said to hop around at night and suck the life out of victims. They're obviously more cutesy looking in official art, but their design is practically one-to-one with depictions in Chinese myth. It's a pretty morbid creature for a Mario game. Nonetheless, I think it's a well-designed enemy, unlike the Tototokos of Easton. Their difficulty doesn't play to the weaknesses of the hardware itself. Instead, it plays to your attentiveness as a player. All other enemies in this game disappear from the foreground a moment before being stepped on, but the Pionpi stays there, flattened, only to return back to life. Even if you aren't privy to the Jiangshi myth, which I'm positive most players back in the day weren't, there's a warning in the game itself that something isn't right with this enemy. This might be a bit of a harsh swerve in the conversation, but we've come up on the largest cluster of deaths throughout this entire playthrough. Even though I die plenty of times, I never fall below the double digits in lives. So I want to take this time to discuss the role lives play and the scoring system in general. The scoring system in Super Mario Land may seem superfluous at a glance. Scores originate from the arcades, a place where the games were usually so rudimentary the main goal wasn't just to beat the game, if it was even a game that had an ending, but to play the game so well and for so long your name reached the top of the leaderboard due to your score. This worked as an incentive to keep kids coming back to the arcades, since many people would be playing the same cabinet and competing for that high score. But once games started making their way into homes, playing for the high score became a little more meaningless. Games with leaderboards that would have had dozens of names written in each day shrunk down to a small handful, or maybe even just one name. Scores felt even more pointless in games such as Super Mario Bros., which had no leaderboard and wiped your high score from the cart when the power was shut off. This was also the case in Super Mario Land. Thankfully, scores had a secondary purpose in earning the player lives and continue should they break certain number thresholds. Lives aren't exactly difficult to get a hold of in this game, but if I did end up losing all of them, I would have been forced to use a continue if I wanted to start at the level I left off on. Scoring systems and lives as concepts got dropped by more and more games as the years went on. They never completely went away, but they started to disappear in games where they weren't needed. It took until Super Mario Odyssey for them to be abandoned entirely by the Mario franchise. To ditch them makes sense for a game like that, but I think it would be harsh to get rid of them for a classic side-scroller like Super Mario Land. Some people may decry this classic way of difficulty, but I believe it has its place. I like the tension of knowing that if I screw up too many times, there's a visible punishment built into the game itself, and I think this method of difficulty makes the most sense for Super Mario Land. Personally, I found Super Mario Land to be quite an easy game, but I can't take that idea for granted. Just because I ended up with over 10 lives doesn't mean everyone will. This is the final level of Super Mario Land, and it's our second shooter level. At first, it might be strange that the final challenge in a Mario game doesn't involve platforming, but this is Super Mario Land we're talking about. Considering it's such a strange game, it only makes sense that it ends unusually compared to other Mario games. Unlike the first shooter level where they showed restraint in battering you with enemies, they're not so kind this time. It's a worthy final level. Mario pilots a plane and storms Tatanga's fortress in the sky. Compared to the first shooter level, you spend a lot less time building a path for yourself out of destructible blocks. The main challenge of this level is positioning. There's so many enemies at first, it's difficult to shoot them all down, so dodging is necessary. Interestingly, there's almost no enemies once you enter Tatanga's fortress. Instead, you're forced to move through winding corridors. At this point, the real enemy is the auto-scroll, which is something this level has in common with the one from 2-2. I think my favorite enemy in this level is the Genkotsu, which we see moments before the boss. Genkotsu is Japanese for fist, and well, that's what it is alright. Before the final showdown with Tatanga, you have to face Birabuto. This enemy is meant to be the boss of the Chai Kingdom. I had interesting things to say about the first 3 bosses, but the cloud that throws chickens at you almost had me dumbfounded, but I found out something neat about its name. In Chinese myth, a Kinto-un is a magic cloud that can be ridden by someone pure of heart. So this thing is basically the flying Nimbus from Dragon Ball. When I was younger, I thought the idea was that Tatanga was using the cloud as a disguise, but considering Tatanga appears from the bottom of the screen after Birabuto is defeated, that doesn't really make much sense. Tatanga may look somewhat tough at first, but he's really not so bad. Basically, just weave between his missiles by going up and down and continuing the fire. It takes a whopping 40 hits, but he'll eventually go down. Tatanga ended up being a footnote in Mario's history. He returned in Super Mario Land 2 6 golden coins as the boss of the space world, but not the final boss. And that was the last time he ever appeared. I think it was a pretty missed opportunity to not have him included in the Super Mario Galaxy games, or even Super Mario Odyssey. Once Tatanga is defeated, Mario can finally rescue Princess Daisy, who, unlike Tatanga, is a character that has managed to stick around after all these years, albeit regulated to spin-offs. Sarasaland is saved, and the two of them fly off as the credits roll. As the years go by, Super Mario Land is going to be seen as more and more strange. The reason being because it has continued to be divorced by the Mario series as a whole. Remember what I said earlier about the team at R&D 1 possibly making this game intentionally strange? That perspective comes from someone looking back at this game over 30 years after its release, a time where the Mario series has cemented its look and feel, and the titular character is practically the face of video games as a whole. Think back to when this game was new though. Mario was in plenty of games back then, but his presence was definitely lesser. The Super Mario series only had 3 games under its belt when Super Mario Land released in Japan. Then there's the Western audience. When Super Mario Land released, the West had only experienced the original Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Bros. 2, aka Doki Doki Panic. I'd say that at this point there wasn't this greater idea of what Super Mario should be as a series outside of being a platformer. And to the West, the Super Mario series was already fairly unpredictable. I think the narrative of Super Mario Land being this strange footnote in the Mario series is only something that's occurred after the fact. People forget that until New Super Mario Bros. And Mario Kart DS, Super Mario Land was the best-selling handheld Mario game, and that's without the help of being a pack-in title in the West. It got pretty great reviews too. That said, I can see how the narrative began. Rave reviews and sales figures aside, almost nothing noteworthy besides Princess Daisy escaped this game, and as mentioned before, Daisy only appears in spin-off titles. Nintendo, for whatever reason, just isn't interested in revisiting much from this game. So, to revisit the question from earlier, why is this game so weird? My answer would be because it's from a team that didn't make the earlier games, and only feels weirder than it is because it has a lot of ideas that never returned to the series. Kind of a long-winded answer, but that's how I feel. However, I wouldn't want to imply that this narrative is all bad. Part of the reason why I became so attached to this game was because of that narrative. It was intriguing to me, a Mario game with barely any familiar faces in it. It's definitely a fascinating game in hindsight, and is also the progenitor for the Wario Land series, and Wario as a character. How much credit you can give to this game as opposed to Super Mario Land 2 in that regard, though, is dubious. Now, what do I think of the game itself, and would I recommend people play it? Well, it's a tad complicated, because in a time where there are so many excellent platformers, it's hard to recommend Super Mario Land over any others. Its platforming is quite awkward, to be nice. The hardware it's on can be a barrier all on its own, and as a Mario game, you can certainly play better ones. The direct sequel, for example, is a more pleasant, tighter experience gameplay-wise. The average person, no, I wouldn't recommend this game. They probably wouldn't enjoy it. Now, a retro game enthusiast, I think they could see Super Mario Land as an early example of a good platformer, portable or otherwise. That's where I fall. If you couldn't tell from me making a full commentary video about this game, I have a Super Ball-sized soft spot for it. But that's about all I have to say about Super Mario Land. Bet you didn't think someone could prattle on about this game for over 30 minutes, did ya? Thanks for sticking around and watching it all, though. I'll be back soon.